The clock didn't tick. It throbbed, a rhythmic blues against the silence of a town that had already gone into hiding. In Oakhaven, the locals don't fear the dark. They fear the math of it. They know that between 11:59 p.m. and the safety of the morning, time stretches thin, like skin pulled too tight over a skull, revealing the skeletal machinery of a world we were never meant to see. Elias Thorne came with a camera, a skeptic's sneer, and a digital recorder designed to capture the nothing he expected to find. He didn't believe in the collector, and he certainly didn't believe in the midnight change. But as the air in his rented Victorian turned to ice and the floorboards began to liquefy beneath his boots, he realized his mistake. The legend said the first 6 knocks were a warning, a steady dismantling of your sanity. But it was the 7th, the one that doesn't come from the door, but from the hollow space inside your own chest, that meant you were no longer a guest in your own life. The door was locked. The bolts were iron. But in the gap between seconds, doors are just an illusion, and the collector is finally ready to finish the count. The silence of Oakhaven. The air in Oakhaven didn't just feel cold. It felt heavy, as if the oxygen had been replaced by something denser and older. Elias Thorne pulled his vintage Mustang to the curb, the engine's growl sounding like a sacrilege in the oppressive quiet of the street. He checked his watch, 6 p.m. In the city, this was the golden hour of happy hours and honking taxis. Here, the sun was dipping behind the jagged silhouette of the Blackwood Pines, and the town was already tucking itself into a collective, terrified crouch. Elias was a man built on the sturdy foundations of logic and espresso. As a senior contributor for the Sentinel, he had spent the last decade debunking faith healers in Kentucky and haunted asylum tours in upstate New York. To him, Oakhaven was just another paycheck, a chance to write a scathing long-form piece on how isolation breeds collective psychosis. His rental was a Victorian relic on the edge of town, a house of peeling gray paint and windows that looked like tired eyes. Waiting for him on the porch was Silas, the landlord, a man whose skin looked like crumpled parchment. Silas didn't offer a handshake. He offered a heavy ring of iron keys and a look of profound pity. "You've got the list of rules I emailed?" Silas asked, his voice a dry rasp. Elias smirked, tossing his duffel bag onto the porch. Rule 1, all curtains drawn by 11:30. Rule 2, double bolt the cellar. Rule 3, ignore the midnight change. It's very atmospheric, Silas. Really sets the mood for the book. Silas didn't smile. He stepped closer, the smell of wood smoke and mothballs clinging to his coat. "It's not about the mood, Mr. Thorne. It's about the gap. At midnight, the day doesn't just flip like a page in a book. There's a tear. Something slips through the seam. If you hear a knock, you count. You count, and you pray to whatever God you claim that it stops at 6. If the 7th knock falls before the clock strikes 12:01, you belong to the change." "And what happens at 7? Elias asked, leaning against the doorframe. "The invitation is accepted," Silas whispered, "and the collector doesn't need a key to enter a house that's been opened." Without another word, the old man turned and shuffled toward his truck, driving away with a haste that bordered on a panic. Elias chuckled to himself, unlocked the door, and stepped inside. The house smelled of lemon wax and stagnant air. He spent the evening setting up his workstation, a laptop, a high-end digital recorder, and a tripod-mounted camera aimed at the front door. If there were knocks, he'd have them on a waveform by morning, ready to prove they were nothing more than the house settling or wind in the chimney. As 11 p.m. rolled around, Elias noticed a strange phenomenon. The ambient noise of the woods, the crickets, the distant owls, the rustle of the pines, simply ceased. It wasn't a gradual fade. It was as if someone had hit a celestial mute button. He sat in his study, the blue light of his laptop screen casting long, distorted shadows against the wallpaper. At 11:45 p.m., he felt a sudden drop in temperature. His breath began to mist in front of his face. He checked the thermostat. It was set to 72 degrees, yet the air felt like the interior of a meat locker. He walked to the window and peeled back the curtain. The streetlights of Oakhaven were still on, but they glowed with a sickly, rhythmic pulse like a heartbeat. He moved to the front hallway, standing before the heavy oak door. He checked his watch. 11:58 p.m. "Okay, collector," Elias whispered, his voice sounding thin in the vacuum of the house. "Do your worst." At 11:59 p.m., the world went stagnant. The ticking of his grandfather clock in the parlor slowed down, the intervals between seconds stretching out into agonizing lengths. Tick, pause. Tick. Then it came. A soft, polite rap. Knock. Elias froze. It wasn't the sound of a branch or the wind. It was the distinct sound of a knuckle hitting wood at eye level. He checked his recorder. The levels spiked perfectly. "Teenagers," he muttered, though his heart was beginning to hammer against his ribs. He stepped toward the peephole, but as he leaned in, a second knock echoed through the hallway. Knock. This one was harder. It didn't just sound, it vibrated. Elias looked through the lens. The porch was bathed in the pale light of the moon. It was empty. There was no one on the steps, no one hiding behind the pillars. Then came the third. Knock. It was louder still, a demanding, heavy strike that made the iron bolt jingle in its housing. Elias felt a prickle of genuine sweat break out on his forehead. He reached for the deadbolt, his instinct to confront the prankster warring with a new, primal urge to run. He looked at his watch. 12 a.m. The time should have changed, but the digital display was frozen. The colon between the hours and minutes wasn't blinking. It was just a solid, glowing red line. Outside, the world had turned a bruised shade of purple. The trees weren't moving, but they looked different. Stretched. Knock. 4. The sound didn't come from the door this time. It came from the floorboards directly beneath his feet. Elias jumped back, nearly tripping over his tripod. The house was no longer a sanctuary. It was becoming a drum, and something was playing it from the outside in. He realized then that the midnight change wasn't a local myth. It was a physical trap, and he was standing right in the center of the jaws. The frequency of fear. By the time the sun rose on the second day, Elias had convinced himself that he had experienced a sophisticated psychological prank or, perhaps, a localized seismic event. He sat at the small kitchen table, nursing a lukewarm coffee and staring at the digital waveform on his laptop. The recording was impossible. The first 3 knocks showed up as standard percussive peaks. But the fourth knock, the one that had vibrated through the floor, didn't show up as sound at all. Instead, the audio file showed a perfect, mathematical silence, a hole in the recording where the sound should have been. Yet, Elias had heard it with his own ears. He had felt it in his marrow. "Subsonics," he muttered, rubbing his bleary eyes. "They're using low-frequency emitters to vibrate the house. That's why the brain perceives it as sound." He spent the afternoon patrolling the perimeter of the property. He looked for hidden speakers, wires in the grass, or signs of trespassing. He found nothing but the oppressive stillness of the Oakhaven woods. When he tried to drive into town to talk to the locals, his Mustang refused to start. The battery was completely drained, which was odd, considering it was brand new. He walked to the general store, a mile-long trek through air that felt strangely humid for a New England autumn. The townspeople watched him from behind screen doors and lace curtains. Their eyes weren't hostile, they were mourning. It was the look people gave to a man on death row. Inside the store, he found Silas stocking shelves with canned goods. The fourth knock came from the floor. "Silas." Elias said, trying to maintain his bravado. "How do you rig that?" "Transducers under the crawl space." Silas paused, a can of peaches trembling in his hand. "The fourth knock is the Earth's acknowledgement. It means he's found your frequency, Mr. Thorne. You shouldn't have been standing in the hall. You should have been in the cellar, ears covered, eyes shut. I'm an adult, Silas. I don't hide from noises in the dark." Silas turned, his eyes watery and sharp. "It's not the noise that kills you. It's the attention. Every knock is him peeling back a layer of your reality. By the sixth knock, the house won't be a house anymore. It'll just be a memory of one. And the seventh is when he walks through the memory." Elias scoffed and bought a pack of batteries and a flashlight. "I'll see you tomorrow, Silas. I'll have a perfectly logical explanation by then." "I hope so," Silas whispered. "For your sake. I hope I'm a crazy old man and you're the smartest person in the world." Elias spent the evening reinforcing his observation post. He moved a second camera to the cellar and a third to the upstairs hallway. He was going to capture every angle. If this was a haunting, he'd be the first man to document the transition of a spirit into the physical plane. If it was a hoax, he'd have the evidence to sue the town into the next century. 11:30 p.m. arrived. Elias sat in the living room, a heavy flashlight in his hand. He felt a strange sense of anticipation, a rush of adrenaline that masked the growing pit of dread in his stomach. 11:59 p.m. The mute hit again. The world outside the windows turned into a flat, gray void. The streetlights didn't just pulse. They bled light, the yellow glow spilling onto the pavement like liquid. Knock. 1. It came from the front door. Knock. 2. It came from the back door, perfectly synchronized. Knock. 3. The sound erupted from the chimney, a heavy, soot-muffled thud. Elias gripped the flashlight so hard his knuckles turned white. He checked his watch. The digital numbers began to scramble, turning into Cyrillic letters, then ancient runes, then back to gibberish. The change was starting. Knock. 4. It wasn't the floor this time. It was the ceiling. Elias looked up and saw the plaster dust drifting down like snow. Something heavy was walking on the roof, something that didn't have the gait of a human. It moved with a slow, dragging heavy-footedness. Knock. 5. The sound was a deafening roar that shattered the glass in the picture frames on the wall. Elias fell to his knees, covering his ears. This wasn't a prank. No speaker system on Earth could produce a sound that felt like a physical blow to the skull. Through the ringing in his ears, he heard a voice. It wasn't a whisper. It was a resonance, a vibration that seemed to come from the very atoms of the room. Elias. He froze. The voice sounded exactly like his father, a man who had been buried in a Chicago cemetery for 15 years. Elias, open the door. It's cold out here. So very cold. You're not real. Elias hissed, his voice cracking. This is a hallucination. Oxygen deprivation. Infrasound-induced paranoia. Knock. 6. The front door didn't just vibrate. It groaned. The wood began to weep a dark, viscous fluid that smelled of salt and old copper. The brass handle began to glow with a dull, internal heat. Elias scrambled backward, retreating toward the stairs. He looked at his watch. The time read 11 hours, 59 minutes, and 59 seconds. The second hand was stuck. It twitched, trying to move to the 12 o'clock mark, but something was holding the gears of the universe back. He was trapped in the final second of the day. Don't do it. Elias pleaded to the empty air. Don't knock again. The house went silent. The mute deepened until Elias could hear the sound of his own blood rushing through his carotid artery. He waited. 1 second. 10 seconds. A minute. The seventh knock didn't come. Elias slumped against the banister, gasping for air. He checked his watch again. 12:01 a.m. The numbers were back to normal. The temperature in the room began to rise. Outside, a cricket chirped. He had survived. The collector had failed. Elias let out a hysterical laugh, wiping the sweat from his face. He walked to the front door, intent on checking his cameras. He wanted to see the footage of the weeping wood, to see if the lens had captured the same madness he had. He reached for the door handle. It was cool to the touch. He peered through the peephole one last time, just to be sure. The porch was empty, but as he started to turn away, he noticed something on the wood of the door just below the peephole. There were 6 distinct indentations in the oak, as if someone had hammered on it with a sledgehammer. But there was a space, a clear, empty space, where a 7th mark should have been. Elias realized with a jolt of terror that the game wasn't over. It was a week-long ritual. 7 nights, 7 knocks. The collector wasn't trying to finish the sequence in one night. He was building a bridge, 1 knock at a time. And tomorrow was night 3, the architecture of an invasion. Elias didn't sleep. He spent the daylight hours of the 3rd day pacing the house like a caged animal. Every creak of the floorboards, every settling of the joists made him jump. He had attempted to leave again, but the town of Oakhaven seemed to have grown a labyrinthine quality. No matter which road he took, he found himself circling back to the gray Victorian house. The GPS on his phone simply showed him sitting in the middle of a vast, white void. He was no longer a journalist. He was a prisoner of a geometric anomaly. He pulled up the footage from the previous night. On the screen, Elias saw himself standing in the hallway, looking terrified. But the cameras didn't show the weeping wood. They didn't show the glowing handle. Instead, the footage showed something far worse. As the 4th knock sounded, the video feed showed the walls of the house becoming translucent. For a split second, Elias could see the skeletal structure of the building, and beyond it, a landscape that wasn't New England. It was a plain of gray ash under a black sun, and standing on the roof, caught for a single frame, was a figure. It was impossibly tall, with limbs that had too many joints, dressed in a tattered coat that seemed to be made of shadows. The collector. Elias zoomed in. The figure didn't have a face. Where the eyes and mouth should have been, there were only geometric shapes, triangles and circles carved into pale, leathery skin. "It's not a ghost," Elias whispered, his voice trembling. "It's a cartographer. It's remapping the house." He realized that each knock was a stitch. The entity was sewing its reality onto his. By the time the 7th knock hit, the 2 worlds would be perfectly aligned, and the door would no longer be a barrier, it would be a mouth. He decided to fight back. If the entity used sound and frequency, Elias would use interference. He went to the basement and found several old radios and a portable amplifier Silas had left behind. He tuned them all to static, white noise, pink noise, brown noise. He created a wall of sonic chaos, hoping to drown out the rhythmic precision of the knocks. By 11:45 p.m., the house was screaming with static. It was a physical wall of sound that made Elias's teeth ache. He sat in the center of the living room, surrounded by his speakers, holding a kitchen knife in one hand and a bottle of whiskey in the other. 11:59 p.m. The mute arrived, but it was different tonight. It fought with the static. The white noise from the radios began to twist, the hissing sound turning into a low, rhythmic chanting. Knock. 1. The sound pierced through the static as if it wasn't there. Knock. 2. Elias cranked the volume on the amplifier. The house shook. The static was so loud now that his ears began to bleed, a thin trickle of red running down his neck. Knock. 3. The radios didn't just play static anymore. They began to broadcast Elias's private thoughts. He heard his own voice through the speakers, narrating his deepest fears, I'm going to die here. No one will find me. I'm a fraud. I'm a failure. Shut up, he screamed, swinging the knife at the nearest radio. He smashed it to pieces, but the voice continued, emanating from the very air. Knock. 4. The floor didn't just vibrate, it liquefied. For a heartbeat, the rug beneath Elias's feet felt like deep, cold water. He scrambled onto the sofa, watching as the floorboards rippled like a pond hit by a stone. Knock. 5. The collector appeared, not as a physical being, but as a shadow cast against the static. The shadow stretched across the room, its long, multi-jointed fingers reaching for Elias's throat. Elias swung the knife, but it passed through the shadow like smoke. Knock. 6. The sound was so powerful it blew out every speaker in the room simultaneously. The silence that followed was absolute. The static was gone. The radios were smoking ruins. Elias sat on the sofa, shivering, waiting for the 7th. He knew the pattern now. He knew the collector was waiting for him to reach for the door, to acknowledge the change. But then, a new sound began. Not a knock, a scratching. It was coming from the other side of the sofa. Elias slowly turned his head. A pale, needle-like finger was poking through the fabric of the cushion. It was followed by another and another. The entity wasn't just at the door anymore. It was bleeding through the furniture. Not yet. A voice hissed from inside the sofa. The 7th is for the final night. Tonight, we just observe. The fingers retreated. The floor solidified. The mute lifted. Elias didn't wait for 12:01. He ran. He burst out the front door, sprinting toward the woods. He didn't care about the car or the cameras. He just wanted to be away from the architecture that was being rewritten. But as he reached the edge of the property, he hit an invisible wall. It was cold, hard, and tasted of ozone. He pounded on it, screaming for help, but the village of Oakhaven remained dark. He was trapped in a glass jar, and the collector was just waiting for the right time to unscrew the lid. The dissolving world. On the 4th and 5th nights, Elias Thorne stopped being the hunter and became the prey. He no longer tried to document the events. He no longer tried to fight the frequencies. He spent his days sitting in the middle of the kitchen floor, the only place that still felt solid. The house was losing its grip on the three-dimensional world. The hallway that led to the bathroom now seemed to stretch for miles, the door at the end a tiny, distant speck. The kitchen sink ran with a dark, oily liquid that whispered secrets when it hit the basin. Elias's appearance had decayed. His eyes were sunken, surrounded by dark rings of exhaustion. He had stopped eating, convinced that the food in the pantry had been replaced by ash and illusions. On the 5th night, the knocks were accompanied by a visual distortion that made Elias feel as if his retinas were being peeled. Every time the collector struck the house, the colors of the world inverted. The black shadows became blinding white light, and the walls became a nauseating shade of ultraviolet. Knock, knock, knock. The first 3 were almost rhythmic now, a heartbeat for a dying world. By the 4th knock, Elias saw the collector clearly. The entity was standing in the kitchen with him. It didn't move. It didn't attack. It just stood by the refrigerator, its faceless head tilted as if it were studying a fascinating insect. "What do you want?" Elias whispered, his voice a ghost of itself. The entity raised a long, spindly hand and pointed at the grandfather clock in the parlor. The change, the entity vibrated. "The world is a circle, Elias. But circles have edges. I am what lives on the edge." Knock. 5. The kitchen table folded into itself, the wood turning into a complex origami shape before vanishing entirely. Knock. 6. The walls of the house began to peel away like old wallpaper, revealing not the outdoors, but a vast, swirling nebula of gray mist. Elias was no longer in Oakhaven. He was in the between. The house was a lone island floating in a sea of nothingness. One more, the entity said, its voice sounding like 1,000 dead leaves. One more, and the circle is broken. One more, and you come home. The entity vanished as the clock hit 12:01. Elias spent the 6th day in a state of catatonic shock. He realized that this 7th knock wasn't something the collector did to him. It was something he had to allow. The first 6 knocks were the destruction of his world, but the 7th was the opening of the door. If he didn't answer, if he didn't acknowledge the 7th knock, the entity couldn't claim him. But the house was almost gone. By the afternoon of the 6th day, there were no windows. There were no doors. There were only holes in reality where they used to be. Elias sat on a lone chair in a room that had no floor, suspended over the gray abyss by sheer force of will. He saw Silas, or a version of Silas. The old man appeared in the mist, walking on nothing. "It's almost time, Elias," the apparition said. "You think you're smart because you didn't open the door, but you forgot one thing." "What?" Elias croaked. "You're the one who invited him," Silas said, his face distorting. "The moment you thought this was a hoax, the moment you challenged the legend, you knocked first." "He's just answering." The apparition dissolved into ash. Elias looked at his hands. They were turning gray. The tips of his fingers were starting to fade into the mist. He wasn't just losing his house. He was losing his existence. The collector wasn't an intruder. The collector was a mirror. 11:59 p.m. The 6th night. The knocks came fast. Knock, 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 knock. 6 strikes, like a burst of machine gun fire. The house vanished. The chair vanished. Elias was falling through the gray void. A scream caught in his throat. But he didn't hit bottom. He landed on a solid, wooden surface. He opened his eyes. He was back in the front hallway of the Victorian house. Everything looked normal. The lights were on. The air was warm. But as he looked at the front door, he saw it. The 7th mark. It wasn't an indentation. It was a hole. A small, perfect circle in the center of the oak. And through that hole, he saw an eye. It wasn't a human eye. It was a geometric arrangement of light and shadow, staring at him with an ancient, hungry curiosity. "Tomorrow," the eye whispered, "the change is complete." The 11 hours, 60 minutes p.m. The 7th day in Oakhaven was a day of perfect, terrifying clarity. The sun hung in the sky, but it didn't move. The shadows remained fixed. The town was empty. Elias walked to the general store, but the shelves were empty. He walked to the police station, but the desks were covered in a century's worth of dust. He was already on the other side. He just didn't know it yet. He returned to the house. He didn't try to run. He didn't try to hide. He went to the parlor and sat in the grandfather clock's shadow. He watched the pendulum swing. Left, right, life, death. He understood now. The 7th knock wasn't an ending. It was a transition. Oakhaven wasn't a town. It was a filtration system. Those who believed survived by hiding. Those who doubted were processed. 11:30 p.m. Elias stood up and walked to the front door. He straightened his collar. He looked at the camera he had set up on the first night. It was still there, the red light blinking. "My name is Elias Thorne," he said to the lens. "I came here to prove that there are no monsters." I was right. There are no monsters. There is only the change. And the change is just another word for the truth. 11:59 p.m. The world didn't go mute this time. It began to sing. A low, choral hum that vibrated through the walls, the floor, and Elias's own teeth. Knock. 1. The front door vanished, replaced by a curtain of gray mist. Knock. 2. The walls dissolved. Elias stood on a platform of floorboards in the middle of the Oakhaven woods. But the trees were made of bone, and the sky was a swirling vortex of stars that didn't exist. Knock. 3. Elias's memories began to play out in the air around him. He saw his childhood, his career, his failures. They looked like old, grainy film strips, flickering and then burning away into ash. Knock. 4. The collector appeared. He was no longer a shadow. He was a towering figure of light and geometry, his coat flowing like liquid mercury. He stepped onto the floorboards, his weight making the wood groan. Knock. 5. Elias felt his physical body begin to unravel. His skin turned into light, his bones into sound. He wasn't afraid. The dread had been replaced by a profound, cold curiosity. Knock. 6. The collector stood inches away from him, the faceless head tilted down. The geometric eyes pulsed with a rhythmic light. The 7th knock, the collector vibrated. Who gives it, Elias? Elias looked at his own hand. It was no longer flesh. It was a shimmering, translucent limb of energy. I do, Elias said. He reached out. He didn't knock on a door. He reached into the center of the collector's chest, where a single, wooden panel floated in the light. He curled his fist. He struck the wood. Knock. 7. The universe inverted. The sound was the loudest thing Elias had ever heard, and then the quietest. The gray mist exploded into a kaleidoscope of colors. The woods of Oakhaven, the Victorian house, the between. It all collapsed into a single point of light. 12 p.m. The clock didn't strike 12:01. The digital display on Elias's watch shifted to a number that shouldn't exist. 11 hours, 60 minutes. In the village of Oakhaven, Silas stood on his porch, watching the light fade from the Victorian house. He saw the house flicker, turn into a silhouette, and then simply vanish, leaving behind an empty, overgrown lot that looked as if no building had ever stood there. Silas sighed and checked his own watch. 12:01 a.m. Goodbye, Mr. Thorne, he whispered. I hope the view is better from that side. Inside the 11 hours, 60 minutes, Elias Thorne stood in a world of infinite possibilities. He wasn't a journalist anymore. He wasn't a man. He was a part of the change. He looked down at the village of Oakhaven, which now looked like a toy set from his new vantage point. He saw a car pulling into the outskirts of town. A young woman, a photographer looking for urban legends, was driving toward the empty lot. Elias smiled. He walked to the edge of his new reality. He reached down toward the roof of the rental house that was about to reappear for its next guest. He raised his hand. He didn't need to wait for midnight. He was the midnight now. Knock. The first knock echoed through the young woman's car, and the cycle began again.